Hey everyone, welcome to another session where we're going to continue building our SoundSystem tool. In this video, I want to wrap up the MusicManager so that we can blend multiple music players into each other. And to show you what I mean, when we test our SoundSystem, we have our layer blending, but if we want to blend from one song to another song, it's still a hard cut. And let me show you what I mean by that. If I hit the play button in our scene so far and I play one song and I'll increase the layers. So now I'm going to play another song and you're going to hear a hard cut. What we want is the songs to blend between each other, but right now it's just a stop and then a blend up the next song. So take a listen for that. So you hear that hard stop at the beginning. What we want is we want one song to fade out as another song is fading up. And a lot of places would call this a cross blend. So basically we're blending up one while the other one is blending down. So that's the effect that we want to get. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to do that with two different music players because the bare minimum that we need in order to accomplish this effect is two different songs. So we need to have one song playing that is fading out and then a separate music player that is fading in the next one. Now, the way that we're going to set this up is we're going to do this with two music players because that's all we need to accomplish what we want to accomplish. But long term, you could have multiple. So like if you were doing a rapid fire blend between three songs or whatever, personally, I think that situation is so rare that I don't think I'll need it. But if you wanted to expand on it later, you could do something like object pooling and then create as many music players as you want. But I'm just going to show you the bare minimum to accomplish our problem at the moment, and then you can expand on that later if you want. So we'll just do two music players. One, we will stop and fade out. At the same time, we are telling the second one to play and fade up. So that's what we're going to do. So to do that, let's open up our code. And most of this is going to take place inside the MusicManager. Our music player is pretty self-contained at this point. We have our layer blending. We are keeping track of a song inside the music player. We just want our MusicManager to tell one music player to fade down and stop, and then tell a second music player to fade up. So I think we can do everything we need to do inside of our MusicManager. So we'll do that. Again, we're just going to create two different music players, an active one and an inactive one. Whenever our active one stops, we'll blend that one down and then make the inactive one the newly active one and blend that one up. And then we'll just swap them back and forth. So what that means is right now we've been working with a music player, but we actually need two. We need a active music player and an inactive music player. And because the active one and the inactive one are going to switch, I'm just going to make two, and then I'm going to define active and inactive through a property. And I'll show you that in a second. First thing I want to do is I'm going to double click my music player and I'm going to rename this. So highlight it, right click, rename, just call this music player 1. And then we're going to make a second one, music player 2. The way that we're going to track which one is active is we're going to make a Boolean, and this will only work if you only have two music players. Otherwise, you'll need to build an object pooling system, which I think it's going to complicate our example for what we're trying to do. But if you wanted to convert this into an object pooling, you just have to take out this, Boolean tracking just one of two states, and then turn that into a get an inactive music player, play that one, stop this one, return it to the pool kind of setup. So the way that we can track this is we can just say if one of our two music players is playing, then we know that that's the active one. If it's not playing, then we know the other one's the active one. And it's kind of a weird way to think about it, but this is just one easy way to track if it's one of two things. So we'll say Boolean is music player 1 playing. Give it a default. So here's the weirdest part of all this. Using properties, I can create a method that will return the active music player no matter which one it is. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to actually define an active or an inactive. So if anything wants to get the active music player, because it's going to swap, right? Like one's going to fade down the other one's going to fade up. We want easy access to whichever one is active, whichever one is deactive. So we can create a property called MusicPlayer. It's of type MusicPlayer, and we'll call this ActivePlayer. And if someone tries to access this, we want to return. And there's lots of ways to do this. I'm just going to I want to show you how you can do a conditional statement one-liner. So in this conditional one-liner, I want to test a condition. In this case, it's a Boolean. And if the condition is one thing, give me something in return. If it's the other, give me another thing in return. So the way that we can do this is we're going to return, give it a condition, and our condition is music source 1 playing? Right? So this is our condition. And the syntax for this is question mark. So we're asking a question. Is MusicPlayer 1 playing? If it is, then return MusicPlayer 1. If it's not, return MusicPlayer 2. And we're actually not setting this yet, so we still need to make this work. But the question that we're asking is, if MusicPlayer is 1, then that's the active MusicPlayer and return it. If it's not, then MusicPlayer 2 is the active one. We could extrapolate this if we want, but just to make it easier for other things to simplify code for other things, we'll just say inactive MusicPlayer. InActivePlayer is if, we'll just do the opposite. Is MusicPlayer 1 playing? Ask our question. If it is, then our inactive MusicPlayer is going to be the other one, right? MusicPlayer 2. So we're just doing the opposite of this top one. If it's not playing, then our inactive player is MusicPlayer 1. This conditional statement, if it's true, return this first thing. If it's false, return this other thing. Originally, I had this broken out into an if block, but I realized that I could simplify it. And I think this is a good opportunity to show you how you can use a property to run some simple logic without having to break that out and muddy up your code down here. This is why properties are very powerful, is you can run some logic and simplify your code. If I want to know anything about getting the active player, it's right here. I don't have to put that inside of all my other logic, and pretty handy. So now anytime we want to get our active player or inactive player, we can run that right here. So we're setting ourselves up, but we're not actually changing the state, which is what we want to do. So assuming that this state is correct, then whenever we try to get the active player or the inactive player, we will get the correct one of the two. And now that we have this set up, we can start doing our blending, because we can set our MusicPlayer 1 and tell it to play, and then if we get the stop command, tell this one to stop and play the next one. And then we can start to build into setting up that logic. So let's start off with our setup. Let's make sure that we're actually creating this second music player. So we'll scroll down to wherever we are doing our setup music players right here. So we'll just do the same thing with our music player too. Yeah, and we can actually add all of this onto the same game object. Like we can just add the components. It just means that when we create our game object, that we will have our music player that we create in the scene. On that music player, previously we're creating our music player component, and then, however many layers we have. Doing a second music player, we will create a music player, audio sources, and then we'll make a second music player and then more audio sources, and we'll just stack it all in the same game object. Now, if you wanted to future-proof this a little bit, like let's say that you wanted to go into an object pooling system, you could create this on a separate game object, like maybe even as a child object of your MusicManager, whatever. And then you could use those separate game objects for your object pooling. You could do that if you want. This tool that we're building can be expanded upon later on. But for now, I'm just going to stack these components on one game object just to simplify it. But if you wanted to expand on it later, you would consider breaking this out into a separate game object. So we're just going to do the same thing that we did with our first one, add component. Again, type of music player. And because our music player is self-contained, it will create itself. And that's the cool thing about setting it up this way, is we add our component, it can handle all of its layers. We're not doing that all inside of one massive script. So our music player is self-contained. We are, as a music manager, just controlling how many music players we want. And then we don't worry about it past that. We'll test that later. I think this will work. But at this point, we need to set up our logic for when we play a new song, we want to tell one to stop and tell the other one to play. So I'm actually going to build in a little bit of error checking here because I think I need a little bit more of that. So for example, what if we get rapid fire play commands and whether it's intended or not by the designer, they enter a trigger volume or whatever, and we try to tell this music to play. If we're already playing a music event, I don't necessarily want to play the same music event multiple times. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to track the active song. Let's create a music event. We'll call this active music event. And once we have this created, we want to set this appropriately. So in other words, when we play a new piece of music, we want to set the active music event to be the music event we received. Now here's the thing though. If the music event we receive is the same as our active music event, we don't really want to play it again, right? We don't want to rapid fire trigger the same event. We just want to play it. It's already happening. It seems redundant. So we're just kind of handling that little bit of checking there. And we will put that at the top. Same with our music event, so that if we pass an event that's empty, we return. Pass an event that's the same one that's already playing, we also return. So now when we play a new music event, we're testing it just to make sure that it's fine. We are setting it, and then we're playing it. Now, if we want to stop any current running music event, I think in my code logic, I want to put that before we set the new one, because technically the other one is active until we tell it to stop. Then we want to flag it as not active. So let's do that here. We're going to say ActivePlayer. So again, because we set up our property at the top, however we need to determine what the ActivePlayer is, like we could change this code, we could change this logic and make it better however we want because it's self-contained. We don't care. We're just worried about what the ActivePlayer is. We'll say ActivePlayer.stop. And then we need a fade time, right? Just how we calculated before. And we'll pass the fade time in. Because we're doing a cross blend, we're going to fade the current music out at the same rate that we're fading the next music in. If we want to make this different or more complicated later, we can. We're just going to do a simple crossfade for now. So ActivePlayer stop given the fade time, set the new music event, and then also we want to swap our Boolean. So if music one was playing before, we set a new music event and that one was stopping, we want to just swap our state Boolean. Now again, you could do this with object pooling, but because we only have two, we are able to just toggle logic from one to the other. Just to show you what that would look like, we'll just copy paste. Admittedly, this is not the cleanest way to do this, but I just wanted to show you the simplest, if you only have two, this is the simplest way you can do it. And it is kind of helpful to know how to do this, like toggling a Boolean if you have a use for that later on. So we'll just do the same thing. So the Boolean is equal to not the Boolean. So if it's false before, it will become true. If it's true before, it'll become false. So we're just toggling the state of this Boolean and using that to get the active player. So we just have two music players. We're just toggling which one is active. And now instead of music player one playing, we want to say active player, right? Because we toggled it right here. So the active player right here will be one, but when we swap it, now our active player will be the other one. So we tell one to stop, swap, tell the other one to play. If we were to run play again, this one would stop, swap it, the other one would play. So we're just kind of toggling, saying stop the current one, toggle it, play the inactive one. So there we go. That's what our logic would look like. Now here's the other thing. Imagine that this is the first time that we are running. We don't have anything playing. We don't have anything to stop. There's no music to stop. Another thing we can do to protect ourselves is we can say if active song, active music event is null, actually is not equal null, then stop it, right? Because if we have an active music event, and we're only setting it right here, if we have an active music event, then stop it. If we never played music before, this is the first time we're trying to play a new song, we don't really want to stop yet, right? Because nothing's playing. So just a little check here. We can do that same check down here. Let's say if some script tries to call a stop command, but nothing is playing, we can also check here and say if active music event is null. So if there is no music event, then return, don't do anything. No need to stop if there's no music event. Otherwise, there is no active song. If we tell this to stop, that we no longer want there to be an active song, so we'll set that to null and tell not MusicPlayer 1, but ActivePlayer to stop. We also need to swap out any other time where we were using MusicPlayer 1 specifically. We want to make sure that we're using the ActivePlayer. So for example, down here, an increase layer index, we don't want to only increase the index layer of MusicPlayer 1, right? We want to do that for whichever one is active. So we'll replace that with ActivePlayer. Place this with ActivePlayer. So for increase layer index, ActivePlayer, decrease layer index, ActivePlayer. Honestly, I think this might be it. Let's go through our logic one more time before we test it. So we have two music players. We are creating these instead of music players. We are assuming that the creation process handles everything it needs to initialize these two music players. If not, we can put that in the music player. Once we've created them, we are toggling which one is active by keeping track of a Boolean. We could actually use this to know which one is active or inactive, but I'm just using properties here as a simple way of putting this logic in here so that we can just say active music player or active player instead of having to interpret this Boolean that's state for true or false. All of this together just allows us to do active player or inactive player, assuming we only have two. Active music event keeps track of if we give a play command, we are assigning a new active event. And anytime we hit stop, we are, nulling that out. What else? So have our state logic there. Then down here in play music, we're doing a little bit of checking. We're saying if you gave us something that's empty, don't do anything. We're also saying if the new music event coming in is the same as the one that's already active, then it's redundant, right? It's already playing, don't worry about it, return. Then we are checking to see if we have an active music event, then we want to stop it. If we don't have an active music event, then there's nothing to stop, right? We can just play a new one. But if we have one already playing, then make sure that we stop that with the active player. Then assign a new one to the inactive player, right? So swap to the inactive one, assign a new music event, and play. These things right here, the order shouldn't really matter. All of this together is just swapping to the other player, assigning a new music event, and telling it to play. And then at this point, because we've handled everything we want inside of our music player, we don't need to worry about it further. So our MusicManager is handling the blending between two different music players, but our music player handles its own music event. I think this will work. Let's actually test this out. Save, come back into here, hit play, come into our scene. So I'm going to play one song. I'm going to bump up the layer index with right arrow, and then I'm going to cross blend between two songs. So I'm just going to play one song, I'm going to play another, and see if I can hop between the two. Remember that we only have two, so if one is playing and while the other one's fading out, we need to wait till it's finished before we do it again. Again, if we wanted more than two music players to handle that, we could, but I would consider that to be a feature expansion. So let's test it out. Play one song, bump up the layer index. So I'm going to pause it here. Now I'm going to try and play a new song and see if it blends between the two. Okay, so you can see that blend that we're getting. Now, here's the thing. It's blending pretty fast, which, it sounds fine. Maybe you want this to be more subtle. The cool thing about our system is that we can just come into here and let's say we want the blend to be, oh man, let's really make this obvious. Let's go for 8 seconds. We're gonna go for an 8-second blend. It's a pretty long one, but let's try it out. If I change that to 8, recompile, again, you could actually expose this as a serialized field up here. We're just using this for testing. That's why we named it SoundSystem Tester. Save that, come back over here, hit play. Again, I'm gonna start playing a song and bump up the layer index. And you can even already tell that it took the song a lot longer to play. So now we're gonna do a really long cross blend so you can hear the difference. So you see, you could hear one volume going down while the other one, comes up. And you can also see the downside of that is if you're blending between two very different pieces of music, that it can sound kind of awkward if you have it going for too long. So it really just depends on what you're trying to do. Like if you're blending down something that's very ambient and blending up something that is in a similar key or similar music style or similar instruments, it won't sound as weird. So this is why we want the control to be able to determine what kind of blends we want. So at this point, we have our music system pretty much done. We can create different music events. We can have music players that handle different layers of a music event, so different tracks, and do some vertical mixing or whatever. So we can do some more complicated things with our music. And then we can also blend from one track to another with our MusicManager. And we can do it pretty easily too. Just, our SoundSystem, we create a new music event through a scriptable object, we set it up, and then we just tell it to play. And that's all we care about. We can increase or decrease the layer index. You could actually create a new method to set this manually if you want. You should know how to do that at this point. Or we can stop the music entirely. We can do blending. We can do a lot of cool stuff. So I think this is going to wrap up, our music tool that we wanted to put together. So yeah, you should be able to take this music system and experiment with it and, add it to your own projects.